Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final talk in the Curatorial Development Program, Public Talk Series by Dr. Patrick Connor. I'm Angie, Assistant Curator of the China Trade Art Team at the Hong Kong Museum of Art. Sponsored by the Helen Quad Foundation and the Friends of Hong Kong Museum of Art, the Curatorial Development Program is an initiative to invite distinguished scholars from abroad to Hong Kong to cultivate international scholarly exchanges on the art. With the support of this sponsorship, we are privileged to have China Trade Art scholar Dr. Patrick Connor from England as our first honorable guest to conduct a research visit at the museum from January to March. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Friends of Hong Kong Museum of Art once again for their generous support for this project. Dr. Connor is an internationally renowned scholar specializing in China trade paintings. He has published extensively on paintings from the Far East, particularly those of artist George Chinnery. Dr. Connor currently serves as Museum Expert Advisor for the Leisure and Cultural Services Department and is a Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society. He was also formerly the Keeper of Fine Art at the Royal Pavilion, the Art Gallery and Museum in Brighton. During his 2-month research visits in Hong Kong, Dr. Connor has reviewed our museum collection, focusing on the paintings and drawings by European artists who came to Canton, Macau, and Hong Kong in the late Qing period. Today, Dr. Connor will wrap up his research visits and share with us his observation and his new findings in his study of our museum collection. And I'll take great pleasure in inviting Dr. Connor to deliver his talk titled Looking Both Ways, Western Artists on the South China Coast. Dr. Connor, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming on a Saturday afternoon. Yes, before we look mostly at Chinese export artists, so this afternoon the idea is to look at Western artists who came to China, particularly some excellent pictures from this institution. And the chap on the screen with the two heads is the god Janus. And he is the god of doorways and beginnings and traditions and January, for that matter. And my notion is that the artists who came eastwards from Europe, and particularly to China, were always, as well as looking forward to the new subjects they could draw and paint, they were looking over their shoulder to what would play, to what they could sell, basically, once they got back home again. And most of them did intend to go back home again. They didn't intend to stay. And I should also point out that it wasn't that easy for artists to make a living. Nowadays, artists may consider self-expression or artistic integrity to be the most important thing. But I think in those days, actually making a living was the most important thing. There were no state pensions. There were workhouses for the poor, it's true, and several well-known and apparently successful British artists in the early 19th century actually did spend periods of their life in debtor's prison. We'll see a picture in a moment. Well, this was the artist's dream. This was what all young artists hoped would happen. They'd have their paintings hung at the Royal Academy or at the Salon in Paris, and the royal family and the high society would come around and praise and buy their pictures. Now, this unfortunately only happened to a small number of people, and even if you did get your pictures hung, it was no guarantee that they would sell. And it was the artist's nightmare, if the other one was the dream, and this was that you'd wind up in the Marshalsea prison. And there were several other debtors' prisons. Something like 10,000 people a year were imprisoned for debt each year in Britain in those days. And writers and artists were overrepresented in that number. Charles Dickens' father was one of those who was imprisoned here in the Marshalsea. George Morland, who was the most famous painter of animals of his time, he died in this debtor's prison in 1804. Benjamin Haydon, another celebrated artist of his time, also spent periods in this prison before he committed suicide in 1846. I'm sorry about this gloomy start. Things will get better for our artists, I can assure you. Oh, just on the left is what remains today of the debtors' prison. This is William Hogarth, 18th century British artist's view of good times, Beer Street. And in the good times, everybody's eating. People look pretty prosperous and well-fed. The only place that isn't doing very well is the moneylender, the pawnbroker. And you can see the three bulls representing the pawnbroker about to fall off the wall on the right. And even the artist is doing quite well. He's up a ladder there, painting a pub sign. And he looks happy. His clothes are a bit ragged, maybe. This is Hogarth's idea of the good times, by the way. The sequel to this, Gin Lane, everybody's doing very badly except for the pawnbroker, and the painter has disappeared completely. Well, a surprising number of people, of artists, did start off as painters of pub signs or the sides of carriages. I've just put the pinnacle of the profession on the right, Sir Thomas Lawrence, with his painter of George IV, the smoothest operator and the best connected artist of his time, together with Hogarth's view of the artist on the other side. So painters came in various shapes and sizes. You needed to plan your career, I think. You needed to work out how you could make a certain amount of money. And these two people here, we'll talk about first, they're a team, an uncle and nephew team. Thomas Daniell on the right and his nephew, William Daniell, on the left. Now, Thomas Daniell actually did start off as a coach painter, painting coats of arms on the side of carriages. Then he attended the Royal Academy schools, got to start exhibiting at the Academy, still couldn't really make a go of it. Then his nephew came to live with him after his father had died early, and they decided to team up and get permission from the East India Company to go to paint in India, which they did. And this is a slide I've taken, by the way, from a museum in the Fort St. George Museum in Chennai, as it now is, which tracks the Daniell's route. In order to get to India, they had to go to China first, which seems rather perverse. But that was the way they did it. The outer route is in blue. And they made their way in 1785 to Canton, or at least to Whampoa, Huangbu, the anchorage for Canton. Then they found a ship to take them to India. They spent 7 years working extremely hard, both in North and South India. Then they came back to the China coast in order to catch a boat home, having failed to get back through Muscat. And when they got back, I'll just show you one or two pictures they did on the way. This is Thomas Daniell's view of Whampoa anchorage. And you can see, like other artists, he liked to put himself in the picture. Thomas and William, you can see them here on the right-hand side, wearing their very British hats with their sketch pads out. The Whampoa Pagoda, which is still there, you can see in the distance. And here's a picture in the Hong Kong Museum of Art collection, very nice big watercolor by Thomas Daniell of what he called the second bar pagoda. And the second bar was where the biggest of the Western merchant ships would anchor if even the anchorage of Whampoa Island was too shallow for them. And Thomas Daniell did a number of other drawings in this area. I think he probably spent a lot of time on the ships at Whampoa. In those days, actually going up to live in Canton in the Western factories was something for the wealthy. And artists like the Daniells, I think, were not necessarily regarded as being in that category, certainly not at the outset of their career. And this is what the Lotus Hill Resort looks like nowadays. I have been there, although I admit this is not my slide. This is a tourist slide. And it's got these extraordinary 2,000-year-old quarries, which also appeared in the Daniell view. And the pagoda, which Daniell sketched there, is also still standing. I think they held the National Lotus exhibition there earlier on this summer. I don't know whether you went to that. So here are the Daniells in their 7 years in India. We'll skip quickly through that. Then they come home via Canton. Now, they took with them some important instruments. Here on the left, we've got the camera obscura, and on the right, we've got the perambulator, which in those days wasn't something that children traveled in. It was a way of measuring distances as you rolled the wheel along. And the camera obscura, light enters through a pinhole and creates an inverted image of the outside object, and then a mirror turns that image right side up onto a sheet of paper so that the artist can then trace an outline. And this meant that the Daniells painted pretty accurate views of all the places they went. And when they came home, they did two things. They exhibited as many pictures as they could at the Royal Academy, and both of them exhibited over 100, mostly pictures of India. And the big money spinner was their series of 144 big colored aquatints, prints, which they issued. You can see on the left there those volumes. To get a complete set cost you £210, a colossal amount in those days. And the publication was a huge success. The East India Company ordered 30 copies straight off. And so the Daniells' gamble in going to India and China had paid off. And after a while, they started exhibiting a few Chinese scenes. This was only about 10 years after they got back. And in the meantime, I think they'd had a chance to look at some of the Chinese export paintings which had been brought back to London in that time. Just to show you how the camera obscura worked, this is an aquatint of the Taj Mahal seen from across the river by Thomas and William Daniell. And this is a photograph taken by Antonio Martinelli in the 1990s. Pretty close, I think you'll admit. Martinelli said that actually the light never quite falls as it appears to in the Daniells' view. So the Daniells have cheated a little bit, but in the main, what they drew was what they saw, which was not necessarily true for the other artists who made the trip. Now, just to divert a little bit, to make the point that the Daniells were really following in a European tradition of painting, painting views of notable buildings or architecture or streets in a particular way. And this, especially when it came to townscapes, this was initiated by a Venetian artist called Luca Carlevaris. And at the beginning of the 18th century, he was working mostly in Venice. He would produce townscapes like this, where the subject would be seen at an angle. You've got the Doge's palace not seen straight on, but at quite a sharp angle. And his followers, better known followers like Guardi and Canaletto, painted in just the same way. This became the standard way to paint cities. And usually these angled street scenes would be a backdrop for some sort of lively activity in the foreground. And Canaletto, the artist here, then came to England in the middle of the 18th century, and he painted British scenes in much the same way. I'm not saying that artists always painted like this, but what I do think is at the back of their mind all the time was the notion that this was the right way to do it, and that your subject needed to be seen at an angle and not straight on. The same was true of landscapes. This is by Claude Le Lorrain, the French artist working in Italy, who many people believed was the greatest landscape artist there had ever been. And he also made use of what were called repoussoirs, pushing back. You'd have a big object in the foreground on one side, a not quite so big object in the foreground on the other side, and they would divert your eye down the middle to the distant landscape. So again, this came to be seen as the orthodoxy, the way in which artists were brought up to see them. And indeed, the tradition goes back further than that. This is Caravaggio's famous painting, The Supper at Emmaus. And the two figures on the left and the one on the right are directing the viewer's attention into the central figure. It works with marine painting as well. Van der Velde, Dutch ships in a calm. Once again, you've got the two largest objects either side, and your view is funneled through between them. So when we get to this painting here, we can see that Thomas Daniell is doing exactly the same thing. This is one of the outstanding paintings in the collection of the building we're in. And it's a splendid picture. There are several versions of it, of the hongs or factories of Canton, the only place in China where the Westerners were allowed to trade from 1757 for about 100 years. And you've got the two traditions, the angled streetscape and the repoussoir, both very obvious here. So he's got this huge, rather out-of-scale junk on the right-hand side. You've got the big sail up on the left-hand side. It has been suggested that he adopted this point of view to show the British flag off to best effect, being a British artist after all. And I wouldn't dispute that there was an element of patriotism in this scene. It's not quite so obvious in the other versions, perhaps. And by the time he painted this, he would have had access to the Chinese export pictures which had been coming in to London. And in fact, he did a few sketches when he was in Canton, but not many seem to have survived. I think he made a lot of use of the Chinese paintings which he had at hand in London. You can see the superstructure, which I think he's misunderstood rather, of the top of this huge junk. Behind are the Dutch and the English factories, which were the only two with porticos, really the most interesting one from an artist's point of view. And there's a huge crowd on the balcony. I don't know why there's such a crowd on the British Hong there. His painting of the smaller boats is pretty good. Again, I think he's borrowed quite closely from the Cantonese artists. It's also been suggested that you wouldn't have seen a little English sailing boat weaving in and in about the boats, but I think actually you would. It was the one way in which the Westerners could communicate with their big ships down in Whampoa. In fact, if we look closely at this one, you can even see it's got a name on the back, which I can't quite make out, actually. It might say Talbot, which would probably be the name of the ship, the big ship down at Whampoa, which this little boat was attached to. There was a ship called the Earl of Talbot, possibly it was that. So just comparing it with another version, the one on the bottom left is at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. It's taken from a little bit further back. So I suppose the Dutch Hong gets a bit of a better look in. And you can see he's put the sails now on the right-hand side above the junk to give an even more dramatic repoussoir than we had before. And just one other version of this painting. I don't know where it is now. Sorry, I've gone too far. Whoops. Sorry, I've got very heavy-handed on the laptop here. This is one which we borrowed from an exhibition in Brighton right back in 1986, and it's traditionally entitled A Regatta at Canton. Well, I don't think it is a regatta, partly because the regattas and the regatta club weren't founded for another 40 years, but also because they're not racing. It's not a very good photograph, I'm afraid, but I think what's happened is that the Daniels happened to be in Canton at exactly the time when the first British embassy to the imperial court, to the Qianlong Emperor, was on its way back in 1794, led by Lord McCartney. And they were all there together. They had a big dinner, invited the governor, all seemed to go quite well, and then they had a ceremonial procession back down from Canton to Whampoa, where the big ships were, and then they sailed back to Macau. So that is what I think is happening here, and if you look closely, you can see there's a flag, a Union Jack on all the boats. Now, just by way of contrast, this is what the Chinese artists were doing at the same time, quite different. And the Chinese export artists, the Cantonese export artists, they weren't interested in repoussoir or angled views. They did head-on views. It was quite a different thing. Occasionally, you get the mountains on the right, or a little bit of the city of Canton showing, but on the whole, nothing appearing above the factories at all. And these appealed strongly to Western buyers, I think partly because they clearly weren't quite like European pictures. They were clearly by Chinese artists, and also they were scrupulously accurate, highly detailed paintings, much more accurate, for example, than the Daniell's painting done 10 years after they left. And they'd include the very latest developments in architecture and the latest flags to show who was trading in Canton at this particular time. Just the detail of the junks with the decoration on the stern. And in these pictures too, you see little boats, little British boat again in this case, weaving around. And in this case, you can see what's written on the boat. It's Ganges, and this is a slightly angular way of dating the picture because we know exactly when the ship Ganges was in China. Now you can also take the view from the other side. Here's Thomas Daniell's view from the southwest. He's gone over to the Red Fort, which was more or less opposite the factories, and he's looking back. This came up at auction a little while ago. I don't know where it's gone now. And I think this was, if not an on-the-spot drawing, at least done while he was there, because if you look closely, you can see, if you've got better eyes than I have, S and F and D and A, and I think this stands for, from left to right, Danish, Spanish, French, and American factories. So he's trying to make a note while he's there of where all the different flags ought to be in case he wanted to come back and make an oil painting when he got home, as indeed he did. And it's pretty close. He's between the drawing and the painting, he's made the Chinese vessels more impressive, and he's added red notices on the fort to give a bit of color, and a little more action in the middle as well. But if you compare the two, you can see they're really very close to each other. One of the Daniell's more reliable paintings, I would say. If you look up the far end, you can see the big junks in the distance. There they are, right up in the very distance. And as with so many of his views, he makes the best possible opportunity. He makes drawings, he makes watercolors which he can sell, he makes aquatints which can be printed in a book, and he does oil paintings which can be exhibited at the Royal Academy. Now, as it happened, the Daniells were there at the time of McCartney's embassy, and they met the young draftsman who was attached to McCartney's embassy, whose name was William Alexander. This is Alexander's only picture of himself. He's put a patch over his eye, perhaps to disguise the fact that he's put the eyes on his face too far apart. And he'd also studied at the Royal Academy. He was very lucky to get this chance. He was a draftsman, meant that he did drawings and watercolors, didn't do oil paintings. So he didn't have the chance to hang his pictures in the great room at the Royal Academy and charge large sums of money for it. So he had to make his money other ways. He was thinking of publications, I'm sure, when he set out. And even then, he had to resort to becoming a professor of drawing at one of the military colleges in order to make ends meet. And finally, a curator at the British Museum. So he went on the grand embassy of 90-odd people, plus a military detachment, led by Lord McCartney and Sir George Staunton, and they made their way up to meet the Qianlong Emperor, and they made their way by sea. They took the sea route to Beijing, which had hardly been charted by Europeans, as all the trade had been through Guangzhou, of course. And McCartney got permission to do this by arguing that the gifts that they were carrying would be more safely transported this way. But of course, he also wanted to explore the Yellow Sea in case of future missions. And the Qianlong Emperor agreed to his request. So he made quite rapid progress to Beijing. Just the last little bit from the coast by Tianjin up to Beijing had to be done in smaller boats. So Alexander found himself in Beijing the first time any European professional artist had been there. He had to make a decent painting because this was his big chance, and this is what he did. And it's full of incident, action-packed, as people used to say. And it's, however, not at all accurate. And when 40, indeed 50 years later, it was copied by the British artist Thomas Allen exaggerates it even further. I think the expression is pagoda eyes. The Western artists tended to pagoda-ize the Chinese architecture, making it taller and more upswung at the corners, more vertical, less horizontal. Here's Thomas Allen. Allen's even added a few pagodas, you can see, completely fictional, of course, here and here, and made Alexander's already exaggerated view even more like something out of the Arabian Nights. There aren't any other views, of course, of Beijing of this gate, but I think I've got the right gate here with this photograph, and you can see how different it is. Now, from Beijing, the embassy had to go up to Johor or Chengde, and to his great disappointment, William Alexander was left behind. And he wrote in his journal, to have been within 50 miles of the famous Great Wall, to have seen that which might have been the boast of a man's grandson, I have to regret forever that the artist should be doomed to remain immured at Peking. So poor old Alexander, having made it all that way, for reasons that are still not quite clear, got left behind in Beijing, while the rest of the embassy made their way up past the Great Wall. Of course, Alexander had to produce drawings and watercolors of the Great Wall. That's what he was there for. But he hadn't seen it himself. He had to rely on sketches which were made by the Lieutenant of Artillery and one or two others. So he made these, actually, I think, rather convincing views of the Great Wall at the point where the embassy went through, which were then turned into engravings when the embassy came back. You can see in his watercolor the British busy measuring the Great Wall. The artillerymen are out with their perambulators or whatever it was that they used to measure with. And the same was true with the great meeting, the epic, the unprecedented meeting of the British ambassador with the Emperor of China, the Qianlong Emperor, in 1793. Of course, Alexander had to portray this. This was the climax of the whole expedition, but he hadn't seen it. He wasn't there. So he had to borrow, once again, a few little sketches that had been made by others, and there weren't very many, and listen to their descriptions. He borrowed one or two other engravings which had nothing to do with the occasion at all. And here you see the emperor being brought. There he is, shoulder high. And here are the British, some of whom have dressed up in their academic robes in order to try to rival their Chinese hosts in general impressiveness. And here's the published watercolor. Well, to cut a long story short, the embassy was a diplomatic failure. The British were very hospitably treated, but they were never going to get the things that they had hoped for. The permanent embassy in Beijing was never going to happen. The alleviating of trading restrictions, that wasn't going to happen either. And they made their way back by river and canal in boats which had been provided for them by the Chinese government. And this was William Alexander's great time. He was able to go along on board these boats and make sketches of all the people he saw on the banks. Lots of people turned out to see him. And then he made exhibition watercolors when he got home, and some of these were also engraved. And this is one of them in the collection here. And it's quite a good example of a William Alexander composition, because he sketched all these different things, the archway and the pagoda and the different groups and the tower on the right, all in different places, and he's brought them together to make an attractive, action-packed picture which people would admire as a watercolor and also as an engraving. So it's a kind of fiction which Alexander is producing, even though the individual elements were drawn by him at first hand. Just a detail to see the different elements there. He's nevertheless a delightful artist. On a small scale, he's got very neat, delicate touches. Good choice, I think, to go along. If someone like J.M.W. Turner had been the artist, it would have been quite different. And he usually puts himself where he possibly can in the picture, and you will just see him near the prow of one of the embassy junks. There he is. He's got his blue coat and his British hat, and he's got his sketch pad, of course, on his knees. Not, however, I think, his camera obscura. I think you couldn't rely on Alexander in quite the same way that you would look to the Daniells for an accurate view. Second disappointment for William Alexander, when he got down to Hangzhou, he was then told that he had to join the small party that went to pick up the ship and sail round to Canton instead of proceeding overland by river and canal like the rest of the embassy. So Alexander really only had a fairly short bit of the hinterland of China to see and to sketch, although of course much more than any Western artist had done before. Then they all met up in Guangzhou. They had a big dinner. This is Alexander's picture of the governor, the viceroy. And he writes in his diary, although the mission was a I haven't got to the diary yet. Although the mission was a diplomatic failure, the personal relations between the British and the Chinese do seem to have been very good. And at this dinner, on the leave-taking dinner, Alexander writes, "The viceroy seems to be favorably disposed to the English." People always hope that that's going to happen. His carriage towards his lordship was affable and friendly. It was pleasant to see them hobnob together during the meal. And then there was the aquatic procession to Whampoa, as he calls it, which I think is what we saw the Daniells having done. And the captains of the 14 ships carried the members of the embassy in their ship's boats, writes Alexander, each with a Union flag of silk. Then Alexander makes his way, it's another picture in the collection here, down past the Boca Tigris, the Humen forts, and they have to spend a couple of months in Macau because the British are at war with the French, and they were waiting for a convoy to gather so that all the ships could go home safely together rather than go home individually and perhaps be picked off by the French. Now this is an interesting painting, again in the Museum of Art's collection, because once again it was borrowed by the villainous Thomas Allam, and Allam he makes just a few alterations, and he says that this actually represents the naval ships Imogene and Andromache passing the forts of Boca Tigris in 1834, which was 40 years after William Alexander. And this was the ill-fated, ill-judged mission, the Napier Fizzle, as it's often been called, which one could describe as the first stage of the First Opium War. So Alexander's drawings and watercolors were borrowed for all kinds of things simply because there weren't any others at the time, and there weren't many which followed in the preceding decades either. So here is Alexander's picture of a ship off Macau, very implausibly rendered, and then they went home, and it was time for the different members of the embassy to write their accounts. Alexander, I think, felt he couldn't write an account because he'd seen so little of it. He didn't really want to confess that he'd been left behind. And he does, however, contribute all the drawings to the official illustrated version in 2 volumes with a big atlas volume here, with a picture of the Qianlong Emperor on the front, whom Alexander had seen possibly for about 5 seconds as he went by. But Alexander was able to produce his own book, Costume of China, with 48 nicely printed aquatints and a strong list of subscribers. It was very successful, well received, with Alexander's own text explaining what was in all the pictures. And another missed opportunity. There were these 3 professional artists, never happened before, never happened again. They were all in Canton together, and they go to the shops of two Chinese export artists, Lam Qua and Kung Fu. And you'd think there might have been some way of arranging that they could watch each other paint, get a few tips on each other's techniques, but they don't do that. They just walk in as tourists, and Alexander, in his diary, makes the usual rather disparaging comments about them being copyists and so on. So what could have been a great opportunity, a meeting of professionals from across the globe, didn't actually happen. Just to eke out his experience even further, William Alexander produced a book called Picturesque Representations of the Chinese, with 50 smaller plates. And that was quite a success, so he produced another one, encouraged by his publisher, called Picturesque Representations of the Turkish Empire. Well, of course, he hadn't visited the Turkish Empire, but this didn't stop him in any way. At this point, he was taken over by the famous publisher John Murray, and Murray thought this was such a good idea that he got Alexander to do 3 more volumes, which were the picturesque representations of the Austrians and the Russians and the English. Well, at least he knew something about the English, I dare say. So Alexander making the very most of his opportunities here. Now, moving along now to George Chinnery. I want to mention Chinnery because it's his 250th anniversary this year. It was actually in January, but he deserves a mention. It's been good to see this painting here getting so much publicity in the last few weeks in the big exhibition of paintings borrowed from the National Gallery at the Palace Museum. This is Sir Thomas Lawrence, one of the great heroes, one of the people that most influenced Chinnery's style, I would say. He was a prodigy. He was exhibiting works very young at the Royal Academy. He became the Royal Academy's president, as well as the royal artist. And this is his picture called The Red Boy, picture of young Charles Lambton. And waiting at the airport, I saw what's possibly the largest ever reproduction of this painting hanging on the wall there. And curiously enough, it was also the subject of the first painting ever to be on a British postage stamp. So we've got the largest and the smallest reproductions of the same picture. He was also, I discovered recently, put on a box of toffees. Wilkins Red Boy Toffee. Why you choose that picture to sell your toffee, I'm not quite sure. Is it something to do with the velvet outfit and the smooth texture of the toffee? I don't know. But unfortunately, young Mr. Lambton himself had a short life. He died when he was 13, but at least he was remembered by a lot of eaters of toffee. Now, George Chinnery, followed in Lawrence's footsteps. He went to the Royal Academy, as indeed Thomas Daniell and William Alexander had done, and entered the Royal Academy schools. Here is the life class, where they're sketching the male figure. They also sketched the busts, which you see all around the wall, the sculptures, most of them plaster casts of Roman or Greek heroes. Here's one of Chinnery's academic studies from that period. Oops, sorry, I keep pushing this on too fast. Now, Chinnery also had a backup plan. His father was a shorthand writer, and writing shorthand in those days was an extremely useful accomplishment. The standard shorthand of those days was the Gurney system. There it is on the left. And it was used by writers in Parliament and in the law courts. And until this shorthand was introduced, there was no way of knowing exactly what somebody has said. So especially in the law courts, having an accurate transcription of what somebody had said was a great asset. And the young Charles Dickens, the novelist, also learnt shorthand, the same system, when he was young. There's the alphabet on the left. It's not quite as straightforward as it looks. But Chinnery himself, when he got out to India, you can see he's using the shorthand notes to remind himself of all kinds of things up in the right-hand corner. Now, Chinnery started off in his first few years as a miniature painter. Started exhibiting at the age of 17. And he was a pretty decent miniature painter. Miniatures were very much in demand in those days. There were no camera yet, no photography. So as a way of carrying abroad images of your family or husband or wife, a miniature was the obvious way. But Chinnery was an ambitious man. And he wanted more than this. He wanted the big money. He wanted to be up there with Thomas Lawrence. And his first adventure was to go to Ireland when he was in his 20s. And he was quite successful in Ireland. He became secretary of a new society of artists, got a lot of, and he also found a wife. He married his landlord's daughter, you see on the right, Marianne Vine, her name was, which is in the HSBC collection. Subsequently, he was very rude about his wife. He called her the ugliest woman in India. He also called himself the ugliest man, which perhaps makes it slightly better. And he also started painting in, sorry, there she is. I'm a little bit behind. He also wanted to paint in oil, and in Ireland he started to do this. This is his wife once again, and not many of his paintings from this period have survived. He certainly improved when he got to India and China. In 1800, the political situation changed in Ireland. Ireland lost its parliament, basically. Its members were bribed to become members of the British Parliament, which then ruled Ireland directly. And as a result, Dublin was deprived of a lot of the wealthy people who Chinnery would have expected to employ him. So he decided his next notion was to go to India. And he got permission from the East India Company finally to do this. He had a brother working for the East India Company in Calcutta, which perhaps made it possible. He got, sorry, not in Calcutta, in Madras, I beg your pardon. So he goes to Madras, does lots of sketches like this, which are made into more formal drawings like this. This is the newly built colonial banqueting hall, which is actually still there in Madras, Chennai as it's now called. And he spent a few years trying to make his way in one way or another. He started up a little printed magazine. He did lively sketches of Indian life. And then finally, his first breakthrough was this painting here, which is in the HSBC collection. This is, I don't know if you've read Willie Dalrymple's book, The White Mugles, but that's really about this painting and the surrounding circumstances. They're the portraits of the son and daughter of Colonel Kirkpatrick and his Indo-Persian wife, Khairunissa. And they're dressed in the clothes of the court, the Muslim court of Hyderabad, and they're just about to leave for England to be educated and spend the rest of their lives there. Their names would be anglicized, and they would never see either of their parents again. William Dalrymple in his book says this is why their eyes appear to be a bit red. I think it's more likely that that's just how Chinnery liked to paint them. So on the strength of this portrait, he got another major commission, which brought him up to Calcutta. Calcutta was the place to be. That was the center of British India. And he painted this big picture, which was then engraved, of the Chief Justice of Calcutta, which was reckoned to be a success. He was able to move up to Calcutta, and he was a very friendly, sociable man. And before long, having your portrait painted by Chinnery was an essential part of social life in Calcutta. Here he is in his Calcutta studio painting a young officer who's recently arrived. And Chinnery painted everybody. He painted the governors general, he painted the generals and the civilians as well. And he was extremely successful. However, in some way that has never quite been explained, he got into deeper and deeper debt. Debt, as we've mentioned, was a big thing in those days. Even the great Sir Thomas Lawrence was in debt when he died, and he had all his collection of old masters had to be sold to pay off his debts. Nobody quite knew why. The king said on one occasion, "I can't understand why Thomas is so poor." And somebody said that it's because of his great generosity to women. Nobody has quite known what great generosity to women means, but anyway, that was apparently the reason. And it may have been a similar case for Chinnery. He had a wife back home in England and 2 children. They all followed him out, but only 16 years after he'd been. He also had a mistress, Indian mistress, and 2 new children, which would have been perhaps an unwelcome surprise to his wife when she finally arrived in India. Here's Chinnery's portrait of his friends William and Mary Prinsep. The Prinsep family, there were 7 brothers, all went out to India, and they were all dead keen amateur artists. There was a whole group of people, British people, who were very keen on sketching, and the Princeps also did the backdrops for the amateur dramatics. Here's Chinnery's painting of William, obviously been doing a bit of sketching. And this is a picture by one of the Princeps of the Princeps drawing room. And you can see they've drawn everything. They've probably even made the picture on the punkah, the big swinging fan, which you see up at the top there. And all these amateur artists all revolved around George Chinnery. He was the professional. He was the one who would come around, give them advice, and praise them, blame them, lend them drawings to copy. Chinnery himself would go out into the villages and make drawings, once again rather in the English tradition of painting tumble-down ruins. You can see all the shorthand notes there. And still painting portraits. I've just put in one representative portrait. It's a portrait of Christopher Biden, which is interesting because the United States President, Joe Biden, a few years ago said that he had an Indian forebear and who was a captain in the East India Company, and this does seem to be him, although it's only appeared on the market since. And quite a lot is known about him. He's got his dog with him. I was reminded of William Hogarth's famous picture, which is a self-portrait with the artist's dog who was called Trump. So I thought if one could swap the dogs round, then one could have had, Biden with his dog Trump. But unfortunately, it didn't quite happen like that. Now, the water got so hot for Chinnery, his debts became so great that he had to decamp to Serampore up the Hooghly River, which was a Dutch colony where British civil law didn't apply. So a lot of people who were in debt would do what Chinnery did. His friends rescued him, including William Prinsep, by agreeing to bail him out, provided they had first option of getting money back when he was in Calcutta. He came back to Calcutta. They soon found out that he'd broken his word. He wasn't giving them back the money. So as a final last resort, he escaped to Macau. He used to tell people that he'd done it in order to stop his wife following him, but the real reason was that he was at his wit's end and owed huge sums of money. And I think he was still expecting perhaps to get back to India and maybe even to get back home. But as it turned out, he lived to the extraordinarily old age of 78. Very unusual for an expatriate, particularly in the Far East in those days, which meant that he was in Macau, based in Macau, with side trips to Canton and Hong Kong for another 27 years. In this time, I'm not going to talk about all his paintings, but his arrival in China was a great fillip, a great stimulus to his art. And now, instead of painting rather boring English officers, he was able to paint a much wider variety of people. Lots of interesting Chinese subjects, also the Parsi merchants who were very active in Canton. There's a Frenchman right there. And the Americans, a lot of Americans in Macau with whom he seems to have got on particularly well. And he became a center of social life, a great party-goer, big breakfaster, but also he became obsessive about his drawing. And he only allowed himself to have breakfast after he'd painted 2 or 3 fresh compositions out and about in Macau in the morning. And his drawings are really many people's idea of his best art, and I think I would agree with that. This is one of his favorite places in Macau by the Church of San Domingos. And typically, and in a very European way, he never draws the church full on. It actually looks like this. But he never draws it like that. He just draws a little bit of it. I've tried to stand a few weeks ago in the same place. It's pretty much as busy now as it was then. And in so many of his drawings, you just see a little bit of the church from an angle, or the church with something else in front of it, as if the architecture had to be a backdrop, rather as Canaletto or the Daniels might have thought, and you have all the interesting action in front of it. This is what he's really interested in, is all the figures, the vendors, the haircutters, and so on. Well, here's another view of San Domingos, taken from exactly the point where you can't quite see the middle of the facade. Many such views. Or he paints the famous Ama Temple, and again, you can only just see the temple. What you really see is the rocks in the foreground, which are what, to Chinnery and to many of his British contemporaries, that's really what the subject is about. Auguste Borget, the French artist who we haven't quite got time to squeeze in today, took an opposite view, and he did quite a few straight-on views of the temple and other subjects. Here's another classic Chinnery watercolor, and the Praia Grande, that wonderful sweep of stucco-fronted houses along the bay, is upstaged by the little fort of San Pedro in the foreground, which is blocking the view of the Grand East India Company terraces. And our eye quickly moves, I think, to the fishermen pulling in the boat and the stonemasons who've got little movable sunshades in the middle of the picture. And he found all kinds of different figures to draw. One of his closest friends was one of the Parsi merchants, you see top left. Elderly Chinese men he seems to have found particularly interesting, painted lots of different faces there. And of course, figures about their daily business. There's a barber come ear cleaner on the left, and there's a blacksmith on the right with his anvil and his rectangular bellows for stoking the fire on the right. Here's a nice Chinnery drawing from the collection here of the pavilion of one of the Hongs at Canton. Didn't last very long, but Chinnery's painting it very carefully. He's put in little shorthand notes, light green here, dark green there, a little longer there, so that when he comes to make an oil painting, he knows exactly what to paint. Now here we've got a bit of hot off the press Chinnery research, never been published or mentioned before. And I've been in London going through the Chinnery drawings at the Victoria and Albert Museum. There are an awful lot of them which have never been catalogued or indeed photographed. And I've had the assistance of 2 excellent decoders, which has been a great advantage. And this is a drawing which we've come across on the back of one of the paintings. And the important bit, some of the shorthand says, the front of the keys on the instrument are yellow wood, making a contrast to the ivory tops of them. Well, that's the sort of thing he often puts. But on the right, it says, correct, fill in, March the 16th, 1842, at Mr. Leighton's. Now, if we compare this drawing with this painting in the HSBC collection, I think it's the same musical instrument and the same music book that's in exactly the same situation. And we can, with some confidence, say that this woman, who we never were able to identify before, is Mrs. Leighton. And we know that there was a Sarah Leighton in Macau at that time. She married Temple Hilliard Mason, Temple Hilliard Leighton, who became one of the first lot of British consuls in China. And she herself brought back, I think, the first living pith paper plant to Kew Gardens. So nice to be able to identify her. Well, drawing to a close, we're all very much concerned with legacy nowadays. American presidents and American journalists particularly. Well, there's no room for anyone else on Mount Rushmore now. I believe that the rock is too friable to allow anybody else to get there. I believe that President Obama was asked about the possibility that he might be added to this group of presidents. And he replied he couldn't possibly be put up there because his ears were too large. Well, I have to sympathize with this particular thing. Anyway, we look perhaps at more intangible forms of legacy nowadays. Chinnery was never going to get his statue in St. Paul's Cathedral, as Sir Joshua Reynolds did here. Reynolds more recently had a portrait in the forecourt of the Royal Academy, rather more dashing, in the act of applying his paintbrush to the canvas. But Chinnery did get a splendid monument in Macau in the Protestant graveyard. He's got the grandest monument in the whole place, with a more recent inscription, a trilingual inscription added in 1774 for the bicentenary of his birth. He also, I feel, has a legacy in literature, that he appears a surprising number of times, sometimes thinly disguised, in various works of literature, or at least works of fiction, one of whom was made into an epic movie. Don't know whether you've seen the film Taipan. Maybe better to read the book, but anyway, Chinnery features. There he is being played by Norman Rodway on the right-hand side. And a more recent addition to the Chinnery legacy, Chinnery Gin. Sadly, it's been a fairly short-lived gin. It never made its way out here, I don't think, although the intention was that it would. It's been very carefully researched. It's got particular Chinese ingredients, osmanthus and oolong. I took this slide accidentally including a box of Schweppes tonic, and at the bottom it says, the ultimate mixer, which I thought is rather appropriate. I think one could call Chinnery perhaps the ultimate mixer. Maybe an exhibition one day, George Chinnery, the ultimate mixer. Just continuing with his artistic legacy, Marciano Baptista, Macau-born artist, interesting man, also became a photographer in later life, moved to Hong Kong, and also offered photography in his studio. In his early years, he painted very much as Chinnery did. In fact, he advertised himself as a follower of George Chinnery. As time went on, he moved rather away from Chinnery's style. Here, this view of the Amar Temple could easily have been based on a Chinnery drawing, and so could this picture in the Yale Center in America. The one thing that Baptista hung on to was this dark foreground, usually with a couple of animals lying in the shade, usually goats, a bit of a leitmotif of Baptista's pictures. Just a close-up of the Amar. Oh, the close-up of the Amar Temple I put in partly just to point out that he's included the picture of the junk, which has been there or been renewed several times, but you can still see, of course, at the temple when you visit it. Another picture from the collection here, Hong Kong from the East Front, and he became the supplier of Hong Kong views, Chinnery having died in 1852, for quite a long time. And they're often very specific, very detailed. This is an interesting picture again from the collection here, a house with a balcony in Hong Kong. I feel somebody here could probably identify that house. I'm sure it is Hong Kong, it's not Macau. It's got a very unusual bow window there on the front. I would have thought we should be able to pin this one down. If you look carefully, there's somebody who's either shooting a member of his family with a gun, or I think more likely he's got a telescope. He's looking out to to see. And there's this splendid view of Happy Valley with everybody out on race day, and you can see all the different modes of conveyance to get up there to the races. And continuing that legacy, the artistic streak has continued in the Baptista family in the prisoner of war camp at Shamshui-bo in the Second War in the 40s. This is the grandson of Marciano Baptista, who was the designer and producer of several plays put on by the Portuguese, the Macanese there. And this is a self-portrait of Baptista Jr., Baptista Artista, he was apparently called. And he designed these plays which were put on at the Shamshui-bo playhouse, which was in fact the prisoner of war camp. The original review, London Calling, was put on in London 20 years before with Gertie Lawrence and Noel Coward, so this was a later version. Well, finally, winding up, here's our man Chinnery. And to preserve his legacy, he's determined, I think, to be remembered as an oil painter in the tradition of his heroes, Sir Joshua Reynolds and Sir Thomas Lawrence. So he sent back this picture in the 1840s when he was in his early 70s. He arranged for a member of the Dent family to take it back, and it was exhibited in 1846 at the Royal Academy in London. And it represents the two phases of Chinnery's career. You've got an Indian scene on the easel and a view of the Praia Grande up on the wall. And he himself is staring out with his famously challenging, even belligerent expression, as if he'll spare you a minute, but absolutely no more. And it's nice that this picture, now that the National Portrait Gallery in London has been redesigned and rehung, to see this picture back on the walls there again. And finally, Lam Qua, his follower. I think never formally a pupil of Chinnery's, but somebody who absorbed Chinnery's style very successfully, not just a copyist, but somebody who'd come along to your house and paint your portrait from the life. And he's the one Chinese export painter we know anything about, and we do know quite a lot about him. And he would paint your portrait for less money than Chinnery would charge. He'd certainly get it to you more quickly. And according to one American visitor, the Prince of Canton limners is Lam Qua, who is celebrated throughout China, I don't know if that was true, and is indeed an excellent painter. He takes portraits in the European style, his coloring is admirable, and he was very glad to have you come and look at his paintings and talk over the arts. Another merchant called him a great politician. So obviously he spoke pretty fluent English, was good friends with the Western community, and his pictures were often used as exchanges, diplomatic exchanges. So the Chinese merchant would hand over his portrait to the Westerner, Western merchant would do the same in return. And this particular self-portrait, which once again is in the Museum of Art's collection, has got an inscription on the back, Lam Qua, aged 52, painted by himself, Canton, 1853. Also, the Chinese inscription, which gives a slightly different date, I think 1854, but good enough to pin down his death fairly accurately. So the last slide, second last slide, is his portrait of the Hong merchant Wu Bingjian, known as Hao Qua. And his portrait became an icon, really, of the acceptable face of the China trade. It was Chinnery who'd first painted Wu Bingjian's portrait when he first came to the China coast, but it was Lam Qua who took over the painting and his studio, perhaps producing smaller versions as well. And to quote Robert Bennett Forbes, an American merchant, by his great wealth, intelligence, and position, he was universally recognized as the leader of the Hong merchants, renowned for his wealth and his frugality. His generosity was boundless, but the 2 or 3 rooms which he occupied during hours of business in his vast, well-regulated Hong were furnished with simplicity itself. Very much admired by all sides, and his portrait exists in many versions, as a matter of fact, all over the place. They're all pretty much the same size. They're all very similar to each other. They're all very skillfully painted, and I think we can be very confident that they were all by Lam Qua, perhaps also with the help of some of his assistants, all inspired by a single, slightly different original painted by Chinnery. So I think if Chinnery were looking down today and considering his legacy, I think this particular portrait, which is duplicated in a number of places all over the world now, would be perhaps something that would satisfy him. So that's all I have to say. If anyone has any questions, I'd be very pleased to answer them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Connor, for this really fascinating and comprehensive talk. We will now be taking questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Connor, please raise your hand, and our museum ambassador will pass you the mic.
Patrick, I love a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you. A question about George Chinnery. When he moved to Macau, did he live in different places, or was it pretty much the same place all the time? Just to get some bearing on, you know, I think he ends up, there's a street named after him, which is near a McDonald's, Rue de George Chinnery, and I think he lived somewhere near there down the road, which is now, I think, some kind of warehouse. But did he live in different places? Do you know that?
According to Father Teixeira, who I know we both met some while ago, he lived at number 8 Rua Ignacia Baptista, not the same Baptista, for either all or almost all the time he was in Macau. It's possible that the first few years when he was spending more time up in Guangzhou, that he was in a different place, in which case we don't know what it is. But that's the only address we have for him, and he was certainly there for most of his time. As you say, it's not the same road as Rua George Chinnery, and it doesn't have a McDonald's on the corner. Chinnery would have been happy with the McDonald's, I think.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, you mentioned that Chinnery, he is very meticulous and very disciplined. He makes like 3 pictures a day, and he lived in Macau 23 years. So I would assume he would have painted like over 30,000 paintings. And those paintings, are they in China, or are they in Europe? Are they found, or are they all documented?
Thank you. Yes, interesting question. Where are all the pictures gone? Well, I think he certainly did do thousands of drawings, and the biggest collection of those, 1,200 of them, were bequeathed by James Orange, the architect of Lee and Orange, in 1928 to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which are the ones I've been going through. Paintings, not quite so many, but the paintings he did were generally taken home, taken back to wherever the various traders came from. So I think not many of them actually stayed in China. There was, after he died, there was a big sale of the works in his studio, and there was a regatta on the same day, and there's a newspaper report saying that Macau society has all decamped for the weekend to Macau, but firstly for the regatta, and secondly for the auction sale of George Chinnery's drawings. So they swooped down and got as many of them as they could. Some of them have made their way back to China, I think, to public and private collections. It'd be nice to see a few more over here, really.
Another quick question. Am I right in thinking that George Chinnery only came to Hong Kong on one occasion, for a few months, and during that time he wasn't very well, or did he come more than once?
Very interesting question. I had always believed until recently that he came only the once in 1946, when, as he says himself in a letter, he was too ill to do many drawings. But he must also have come in 1840, when all the British were basically kicked out of Macau and had to spend several months on board ship in Hong Kong harbour, an event which is not much written about. And I would very much like to know more about that. So how much he came on land, this is before 1841, of course. I would imagine that he spent most of his time on board ship. But that is potentially a second Hong Kong visit.
Thank you, Patrick, for the wonderful talk. My question is actually inspired by Jonathan, who is sitting next to me, because he made me think about prices of paintings. There's this fun fact between Chinnery and Lam Qua of how much they charged and the difference between the two. On your research of Chinnery, where do you find, where are the sources of the price he charged his clients? Are those from personal letters, or did he keep a logbook of some sort?
If only. If only he had kept a book of sitters or prices, wouldn't that be great? No, the only prices I've found are in the archive of Jardine Matheson, which is in the Cambridge University Library. And there aren't very many, and also it's quite difficult to match like with like. But I think it is clear that and also there are references in the European accounts that Lam Qua was unable to undercut Chinnery's prices. I think some people went to Chinnery partly as an act of charity, because they're sort of, he was in debt for his whole life. He never got out of debt. He wasn't living in grand surroundings. He wasn't actually paying his rent for the last few years of his life. But if you wanted a well-painted picture to take home with you by a particular date, then you went to Lam Qua.
Test. Hi. Greg Thomas.
Oh,
hi.
Great.
When Chinnery was here, when the Daniells were in India and China, do you know what local people bought from them? Did they only buy oil paintings? Did they sometimes buy these large watercolor drawings? And did any of them make any prints here in Asia, or only back in the UK? Thanks.
Yes. Well, of course, if you wanted an oil painting, you had to hang around. And knowing Chinnery, you might have to hang around a very long time. So much more likely that you would buy drawings from him. I think occasionally he would lend drawings so that you could try doing it in his style. It looks so easy, doesn't it, doing a Chinnery drawing. And then you see all the dozens of people who've tried to do it, and you try and do it yourself, and you realize how extremely difficult it is. The prints, Mr. Wattis has a couple of them. The aquatints of the Praia Grande, very unusual, are printed back in England, aren't they? I mean, I think all the prints that I can think of were done back in England. Is that right, Jonathan? Of course, the doilies set up a lithographic press in India, but I can't think that there was printing out here.
I believe that the prints were all done in England,
yes.
Particularly after Chinnery and after Lam and Borget and Borget in France. So William Alexander, but Chinnery,
yes.
There's very few,
yes.
and a few Metztins. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. I think so. Yeah.
Patrick, good afternoon, if I may. Thank you very much indeed for a wonderful talk again. We heard quite a lot about the artists and their works and their lives. I'm curious to find out more about Chinnery and his personal life. Was he so generous to women that he always was in debt? I didn't hear that much about women or family life when it comes to Chinnery, I believe.
No. It would be very interesting to know more. When people first started writing about Chinnery, they spotted that his wife only caught up with him 16 years later, and they said that, well, clearly he didn't get on with his wife. And that might be true. There are certainly reports that when they got back together again in India, they had arguments and his daughter had to patch them up. And certainly they re-separated, and the wife came back to Brighton and survived Chinnery. So I think he was a difficult man to live with. His two illegitimate sons, neither of them had any children, so there are no survivors in the male line. It would be that we know nothing about the mother of his illegitimate children in India. But all I can say is that the fictional books have lots of stuff about Chinnery's private life, and especially if you look at the film Taipan, he has his studio in a sort of floating brothel. It's quite, it's almost worth looking up what is a fairly atrocious film just to see this one scene. So I'm afraid the answer is no, unless we move into fiction.
This is just a fun fact question. Since he only came to Hong Kong twice, is the reason the Chinnery in the Mandarin Hotel called that because of a portrait he painted?
Is the reason why his
Is it because of a portrait he painted?
Which portrait?
William Jardine, somebody like that.
Well, he certainly did do portraits of William Jardine. I haven't ever found one of Matheson. And both William Jardine and James Matheson supported him. One of the Matheson companies set up a line of credit for him in India. He never quite got away from his Indian creditors. I think he imagined that he would, sailing to Macau, but money was still being paid back 10 years after he left. I don't know of any actual portraits he did in Hong Kong. He might have done. I just don't know. So many things we don't know.
Any final questions from the audience before we... Yes.
Hi, Dr. Corner. It is a privilege for our China Trade Art team from the Hong Kong Museum of Art to study the collections with you. And we have been looking at many different artists, Western and Chinese artists in our collections. If you are asked to choose the most significant paintings you look at, what will it be, or any pick from the collection that you will recommend the audience to look at? Which is one is the most significant?
Okay, Hattie, thank you. Well, I think there are two styles. One is the Daniell picture, inauthentic though it is. It's a wonderful piece of drama. And the other is the Lam Qua self-portrait, which has really been the basis for attributing three other possible pictures as being Lam Qua self-portraits. One of them, he's clean-shaven. There are three, or are there four altogether? And am I allowed to mention the interesting finding of your conservation department, where the underdrawing, when examined by the conservation department here, seems to show a pair of glasses on the nose of Lam Qua in his self-portrait. Very interesting. I mean, lots of artists, Reynolds, Chinnery, painted themselves with glasses. Perhaps Lam Qua thought this would be a stylish thing and then changed his mind. I don't know, but very fascinating finding anyway.
Any more questions from the audience before? Yeah, in the back, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kona. I would like to ask interesting facts or more information about how do Western painters associate with the wealthy families living in Canton and Guangzhou at that time. There are two wealthy families, the Pans and the Wus. How do they gain their trust and paint lives of their family members and the gardens and any private areas? Thank you.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've often wondered about that first Chinnery portrait of Lam Qua, of Hao Qua. Now, all the Westerners regularly crossed over to the other side of the river to dine with the leading Hong merchants. But for one of them to be portrayed by a Western artist in this completely different style, I mean, I'd be very interested to know how that came about. Whose idea was it? And how readily did Hao Qua agree to it? There's a drawing in the V&A collection which relates to that famous Chinnery painting. One would love to know more. One would love to know more. I mean, it has to be said that the Hong merchants and the Western merchants were, for several decades, on very good terms together, it seems. And there was quite a lot of sociable activity between them. I don't think the Westerners met the families of the Chinese merchants. I think that was completely out of bounds. And probably vice versa, because there were no Western women in Canton either. So it was an all-male meeting, I think.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we will bring this to a close. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Connor, for this wonderful talk. Let us give Dr. Connor another round of applause.